Started again. My name is Marty Lexman. I'm the superintendent of schools for the West Allis, West Milwaukee School District. And thanks for spending a little time with us on what's going to be our first kind of public information session about the proposed referendum question. That'll be on the ballot on April 4th. And some of this is a little bit of first a formal presentation, walking you through kind of the story that leads us to presenting this referendum question to the community, and then an opportunity for some Q&A. Andy Cromie's with me. He's the Director of Finance and Operations for the district, and Brian Vissers, who works in our communication area, and they might help with some of the Q&A as well. So, you know, some of the pieces that I've learned in the last, almost 2 years now, having come on board as the superintendent, is first this deep sense of commitment in the community to this place called West Allis and West Milwaukee, and in particular its school district. There's this kind of storyline that I'm sure many of you have heard that I keep running into, and it's often something like, I grew up here, I went to school here, I live here, I work in the community, or it's something like, I went to school here and I left, and when it was time for me to start having my family, I decided to come back to West Allis. So the strong sense of commitment is present in this community. And that's a little bit of what we're asking people to think about in terms of the commitment to the school district as well. Within that, it really is our job as leaders in the school district to really kind of present the challenges we're facing, but then also to embrace new opportunities. So this isn't just about what's going to get cut, isn't just about the fact that there's been significant overspending. It's that we also have to have a vision for moving forward. But what I want to walk through first is the reality of the financial challenge, just so that we're really clear kind of what has led to the major challenge. The story is really about three big things. First is significant overspending, and the recent article in the journal Sentinel covered that pretty well. That's part of the story. There's also a piece around revenue caps, so the amount of revenue we're able to bring in through the state, and that gets capped each year. And then enrollment. So those three things contribute to the financial challenges. But some of the big things that led to the overspending since 2007, 2008 were the purchase of Lane, the purchase of the district office, and the school building next to it on South 70th. Capital improvements that weren't budgeted, so these were taken out of district reserves. The OPEB debt payments that we were required to make. Expansion to full-day, 4-year-old kindergarten. So those pieces weren't built in the budget. Technology leases that weren't structured all that well, and some inconsistent budget oversight. And that led to this picture, which I think tells the story even better of what has happened to the fund reserve. Right? So going back to 2007, 2008, you see that the trend line has been down for years. Even though there's a couple places where it peaked back up, the trend has been pretty dramatically down for quite a while. You notice from 14-15 to 15-16, we definitely hit the brakes on spending. And even though we still went a little bit negative last year, we were hoping to come out balanced. We went under a little bit negative, but that's after a year of $9 million of overspending, and we brought that down to just over $300,000 of overspending. That's significant in 1 year. I've talked about these three kind of pieces that are draining the fund reserves in the district, and we're projecting for next year a budget deficit of $2.5 million. So when we take all of our costs and move it forward, and the typical things that increase every year, like electricity and heat and costs for supplies, we're projecting that we're going to have a hole in the budget of about $2.5 million, and we need to rebuild our reserves. So we're concerned about that, and what we're concerned about is having to make further cuts to what we've already done, and these cuts would really start to impact programs and kids. So we've worked hard in the last year and a half to address these budget issues, right? So it's hard to read that list on the right. There's more information in some of the handouts. But that list on the blue box on the right are all of the things we've cut, reduced, reorganized, restaffed in the last year and a half. And an example I've been using is that for the superintendent's team, myself included, the superintendent included, used to be 6 positions. So that's really running kind of the senior level kind of operations of the district. It's now 4. Now that doesn't sound like a lot, right? Just, oh, you cut 2 people. Well, that's 30%, right? So imagine cutting a workforce by 30%. We still have the same amount of work to do. In the curriculum area at the district office, we cut by about 20%. So some significant cuts. We've raised class sizes in kindergarten to 3rd grade. We cut school budgets first by 5%, then by another 2%. We cut department budgets by 5%. And the list goes on. And we've cut $8 million, including $2 million in compensation for staff. And that compensation is in the form of the performance compensation system that our most highly effective teachers count on as part of their pay each year. And we're not able to offer that at this point or last year. So if the budget cuts remain the only option we have to address the $2.5 million and to rebuild our reserves, that's going to come with some adjustments that we don't think are good for kids. So that's one part, overspending. The other part is this idea of revenue caps. And so the state of Wisconsin caps school districts for how much they can bring in each year through state aid and local property taxes. And since Act 10, that's resulted in still a $303 per student less in state funding, right? So we're still under where we were when Act 10 was implemented. Now, Governor Walker has proposed an increase that'll come through the form of aid, not necessarily a revenue cap increase, but additional aid for students, but that's not guaranteed at this point, about $200 per student. It comes with some strings attached that's starting to be understood in the paper. But it wouldn't be enough to close the $2.5 million for us, right? So we're still, even with additional revenue, and that's not guaranteed yet, we wouldn't have enough to close this budget gap. The additional revenue from the state, we won't have a final answer on that until June or July, and sometimes even later. We may be in, and sometimes it happens, we're in the new school year before we actually know what the school budget will be. So that's why we think it's smart for us to be at least asking the residents of this community to consider some additional support. The third piece of the challenge is enrollment. And so we're currently in a declining enrollment set of years, and school districts go through kind of ebbs and flows with enrollment, but generally across the state, there's declining enrollment, there's just fewer children, and there's more competition. During the 14-15 school year, we had 9,877 students, and this year we're at 9,184. That's a pretty dramatic decline. That's 458 residents and 235 non-resident students in terms of the difference. Now, the non-resident part we're doing intentionally. And so the community feedback since I joined and what the board has wanted is to manage open enrollment a little more carefully. And so that has started to come down a bit. But that takes revenue away from the system. And in terms of resident students, some of that's just fewer kids, but we also have more families that are choosing to go out through open enrollment because of unique programs that other districts offer. One of the strongest examples that we can see, because we know where the kids that open enroll out, where they go, we have a good number of students that go to Milwaukee Public Schools for language immersion programs. Right? So they're going to Spanish immersion and French immersion, and so some of those programs. So declining enrollment becomes a challenge for us as well. I mean, this is what it looks like. And you see 14-15 to 15-16, 16-17, and then our projected enrollment continues to decline by about 3% is what we believe is happening. The grades coming in are smaller. There's a little bit of a bubble kind of still working its way from middle school into high school, and then it probably starts to even out over a number of years. When you look at resident is the blue tall bars, and the red next to it are non-resident students. You see that where we've peaked in terms of non-resident, and we're managing that intentionally, bringing that down a little bit. But the challenge of declining enrollment when we have more open enrollment out is at the same time we have to address the budget issues. We have to be able to do things that attract families, like a language immersion school, like a Montessori opportunity. Like some of the things we already do at STEAM and next generation learning to expand those opportunities as part of why a referendum becomes important for us. So, in terms of facing this challenge, we've worked hard in the last year and a half. I'd rather not be spending the month of March doing these presentations over and over and over again talking about money issues. When you're in education, in a leadership role, what you want to do is create things for kids, not take things away from kids. But this is the reality of where we are right now. And so if we're not successful in the referendum, we're going to make some difficult choices because we have to have a balanced budget. We have to rebuild the reserves. And in a moment, I'll talk about why the reserve piece becomes so important to us. So the referendum is really aimed then at three big things: protecting and developing our educational programs, so the things we value in this community and growing new; attracting and retaining great teachers. I talked about what we did in terms of cutting compensation for our best teachers, and we're starting to lose teachers because of opportunities or better pay in neighboring districts, and then again rebuilding the fund reserves. So in terms of protecting and developing educational programs, I've talked about a number of these things already. We're deeply committed to personalized learning. We want to see that continue and expand. We want to be able to offer unique learning opportunities that'll attract and keep families here. But we also feel that all of the courses we offer, and especially things like our unique electives, like our music program, like our arts program, are things we should protect. In terms of attracting and retaining great teachers, the most important thing outside of family influence that contributes to student achievement is a great teacher. Right? It's clear in the research and education. The value of a great teacher is important to us. There are times right now where we can't even get enough substitutes to cover classrooms when teachers are at professional development or when they're out of the classroom because they're not feeling well, or they have kids at home that aren't feeling well. So even that is competitive right now with neighboring districts to get enough substitutes. We're facing some bidding wars in teacher positions that are kind of high need or difficult to fill. And the best example is anything in career and tech ed. To find an engineering teacher, to find a shop teacher, those teachers are few and far between nowadays, and they start to command more salary than what would be typical for teachers. And trying to keep those teachers here is a challenge when we have limited financial resources to support that. And there's the high cost of employee turnover. We did exit surveys for teachers last year that left us for reasons that were different than, I retired, or my spouse got a new job and we're moving out of state. But for teachers that were here and then took a job in neighboring districts, we do exit surveys, and more than 40% of them said their main reason for leaving was better pay in another district. And so we know that that's a pressure for us to try to respond to. And then we want to really be able to recognize really good teachers. So the performance compensation system that the board adopted a number of years ago, we'd like to be able to fund that to support and encourage really great teaching. In terms of rebuilding the district reserves, I said I would get to why this becomes so important. At the end of this year, and with the OPEB settlement that came in, if the sale of the properties on 70th Street closes, and some of the really careful budget management we've been doing, we think we'll be back to about $10 million in reserves, and that's great. To go from negative reserves to $10 million in a period of a year and a half is pretty phenomenal work. But what we really need is 18 to 20 million in the reserves. Now you can think of the reserves as kind of like your home savings account. It's not identical. This is really the balance sheet for the organization. But reserves become important for two big reasons. Reserves means we can reduce borrowing, and that reduces the amount of interest payments we make. What happens when you have no reserves or negative reserves in our case, there are times, just like a business faces, when cash flow is lower than the bills you have to pay. Right? It happens in all kinds of businesses, including school districts. School districts get their revenue in from the state, from local property taxpayers, several times during the year. It's not spread out evenly throughout the year. And so that means there are times when we spend all the money that comes in because we have to pay our bills, we have to pay people to work, and then there's no more money in the bank, and districts then use reserves. Well, we don't have any reserves at this point, And so we then go out and short-term borrow. Most districts in the state do some short-term borrowing to kind of get through those points where you don't have money in the bank to keep paying your bills. But we're in a situation, we're now borrowing so much and for longer periods of time that this year we'll pay $1 million in interest. And that's one of the critical factors in this, because $1 million is about 10 teachers, right? And Andy was quoted in the big newspaper article about this, and essentially we're throwing that money away, right, on interest payments. But we have to borrow money because we can't stop paying people. And so that $1 million with healthy reserves would be reduced significantly. And then that $1 million gets added to the operating budget of the district, right? So it goes back to kids. And even though, there's been some criticism that this is all talk about money, 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 in the end, this really is about kids. And that's the best example of it, that right now there's $1 million going out the door to pay banks that could be used to support teachers and art programs for kids. The other thing that's important about healthy reserves is it allows us to respond to emergencies. So we're living in a situation right now where if we have a boiler or two that goes down, we'd have a really hard time figuring out how to replace and repair them. We don't have reserves to draw on. Now we're lucky it's a pretty mild winter, but it's kind of living with the fear that you've got an old furnace that is going to go out someday and you've got no money in the bank ready to respond to that. And so we're living kind of in that situation right now. So this idea of, we just don't have the dollars set aside for a rainy day. So in terms of without the funding, so this has been a question that has come up over and over through kind of the initial communication and information sharing, is that tell us specifically what will get cut. And it's a little bit hard to be absolutely detailed because we don't know what will happen with the state budget. But these are the things we think are probably given a worst case scenario, meaning no new revenue comes from the state and the referendum fails. So we would propose these things to the board. Again, the school board would make the final decision here, but eliminating elementary music lessons. And the power of, I believe strongly, the power of our music program, which is really phenomenal, starts with kids getting access to great music lessons early on, but we spend $140,000 a year on that. We would eliminate all intermediate sports and certain high school sports, some of the smaller teams that are, so for example, the golf, tennis, gymnastics, swimming, diving. That saves about $250,000. We would reduce 50% of the positions that support library and classroom technology implementation. So they're called technology integrators. They support the libraries in schools and then also work directly with teachers in classrooms when kids are working with learning and technology. So that would save about $560,000. We would increase class size at the secondary level. That means intermediate and high school. And right now we staff at 27 to 1. We would go to 30 to 1. That doesn't mean every classroom is 30 students. There are many classrooms that, because of safety or equipment, you have much smaller, but then some classrooms get quite a bit bigger than 30, which we don't like. But we've already raised class size in kindergarten to 3rd grade. So that's why elementary is not there, but we looked at high school. And then reducing staff compensation, and that's that compensation that is meant to recognize our best teachers. So $1 million there, and that gets us to the 2.5 or a little bit more than the $2.5 million of what we would be reducing without a successful referendum. So this is now really kind of going back to that sense of the community having a real commitment to West Allis and West Milwaukee. So on April 4th, this is the actual question that will be on the ballot. So it's really, should we be authorized to exceed the revenue limit for $2.5 million a year for 5 years? So it's over the 5-year period. Our commitment, and I say our, mine, and Andy's, is really that over that 5 years, we're able to do those things, protect and grow the programs we love, attract and retain great teachers, and rebuild the fund balance. Once the fund balance is back to where it should be, we shouldn't need to continue with the $2.5 million a year. This allows us to accelerate out of the financial challenges. So what that turns into for taxpayers, so if it is supported on a property of $100,000, it's $5 a month or $58 a year. You can see what, you know, for a property about $200,000, $10 a month, or $116 a year. So that's a little bit of what it turns into for property taxpayers. And then this really is, you know, again, united in commitment to what we need to accomplish here for kids. You know, it was really in the debate the board had about whether or not we should even put this on the ballot, was really what really the board in their deliberations as they debated with one another, what really led them to the conclusion that we should put this on the ballot is, you know, we've done a lot to try to fix what happened, and the additional revenue would really be good for kids. But instead of us, meaning the board, deciding to cut further, let's ask the community. Let's ask the community what they think about this, and let the community decide. And that'll give us the direction going forward.